Hilchos Keilim Perek Chamishi, the laws of utensils, chapter 5. In these beginning chapters of these laws, the Rambam is basically dealing with general concepts that refer to all utensils. So we had a chapter about the fact that utensils have to have a receptacle, a clay kibul. And then we had a chapter about it has to be made for transportation. You have to be able to move it around, not just sit in one place. Today's chapter is what's called Gemar Melacha. Gemar Melacha means the final stage of processing a utensil. A utensil only becomes a utensil once it is in its more or less finished state for use. Now, as we're going to see, finished state doesn't literally mean that it's fully ready for use. As long as what's called a tsuras kli, as long as it has what's called a form of a utensil, a general form of a utensil, that already makes it a kli significantly enough to become tameh. Now, what makes these chapters difficult, in general, these chapters of Keilim, is that the Rambam references tens of different types of utensils in one chapter. And so you have to research each one and what they are, and there's different approaches in the commentaries. So in preparing this chapter, I was very assisted by the Art Scroll Mishnayos, this one, the Yad Avraham. They have today, they just made ones called the Mishnah Elucidated. It's a shorter version, but it doesn't always incorporate the Rambam. This set always incorporates the Rambam. So that was very helpful. Plus, this book that we've been using also for the last couple of days, Mishnah Behira, they have lots of nice pictures. So while I wasn't able to get them all onto the screen, we'll take a look at some of them from the book today. So with that, let's get into it. Halacha Aleph. Kol HaKeilim. All utensils. Ein mekablin tuma ad shetigomer melachtan. They don't even become susceptible to being impure until their work is finished. And again, work is finished means they're more or less ready to be used. So we have to get clear definitions for that, at least for the common examples of those times. Says the Rambam, so when exactly is the point at which wooden utensils become susceptible to impurity? So he begins with the following: Hamita v'ha'arisa, a bed and a cradle. Beds and cradles were more or less formed in the same way. This was a classic bed. You see it here? Yeah. So it had a frame, different blocks and supports that we actually mentioned yesterday a little bit, and sometimes there was a canopy over the bed. But the point is, it was a wooden utensil, so were cradles. They were probably built with a little bit more of a wall to hold the baby inside. And the Rambam says, at what point do these become finished utensils? Misha yeshufeim ba'oir hadag, from when you smooth them down with fish skin. Okay? Now, the commentaries explain, sandpaper? It was kind of a sanding down. Yeah, literally. Because raw wood would be unfinished with lots of splinters. Nobody's going to sleep on a bed that could poke you. So what they would do is they would smooth it down. And fish skin was apparently had the properties of smoothing. So once you smooth it down, now it's ready to use, and it becomes, or it could become tameh. Gamar shalei lashuf, if in the middle, that's how the commentators explain, in the middle of the sanding process, you decided you don't want to sand it down anymore, you're done, mekablin tuma. At that point, they already become fit to become impure, because clearly if you decided to stop sanding it, that means that at this point it's good enough for you. So if you decided not to do it at all, then the commentaries say what's called batla daita yetzel kol adam. Your mind is nullified. Nobody cares about what you think. You can't have an unfinished bed completely. But if you did partial sanding and partial not, that's fine. Hasalim shal eitz, wooden or wicker baskets. So we have to know how wicker baskets were made. These are pictures from this Art Scroll Mishnayos that I used. This is just a classic, standard wicker weaving. The way it used to work was you have what's called the spokes, which is long twigs. You kind of line them up like a star, and then you begin to weave them by weaving thinner twigs around them. So these big spokes would kind of stay in place. They never got really moved. You would weave around and around and around more and more smaller branches. Once you reached the amount that you wanted the bottom to be, you would fold these spokes upwards and continue weaving now around. At this point, they're called stakes, apparently. Once the basket begins to go up, those spokes are now called stakes. The inner branches that you put are called weavers. And you keep on going around and around and around and around till you reach the height of the basket that you want. At that point, the spokes or the stakes are still sticking upwards. So how do you secure those? So then you began to fold the spokes over and weave them into each other. Not sure if you can see this clearly here, but basically these top ones are actually the spokes being folded over. You see this here? He folded down one of the spokes, and now he's weaving it through the other ones. Then he's going to fold down this one, and then fold down this one. So all the spokes get folded, and then you have a secure rim. That's point one. Point two is that since the weavers, these little branches going inside, were not one long unit, obviously you can't find one long piece of wicker that's that long, so obviously through the process of weaving, there'd be a bunch of little protrusions sticking in and out of the basket of those loose ends. So another part of securing the wicker basket was cutting off those loose ends. So the Rambam says, Hasalim shel eitz, when do wicker baskets become utensils? Misheyachsoim sifsei sehen, when you secure their rims, that's this part I was talking about, you begin to weave the spokes into each other. Plus, v'yichreis uktzei hasarigim, v'ha'eitzim haktanim, and you cut off the edges of the branches and the small pieces of wood, hayotzin al gav hasal, that stick out on the edges, or on the surfaces, I should say, of the basket. And here it refers to both inner surfaces and outer surfaces, because wicker baskets were very commonly used. You wouldn't touch it on the outside if it had pokey things. You also wouldn't touch it on the inside if it had pokey things, because you can't use it properly. However, it says that Rambam hayu asalim shel tomorrow, if the baskets were made, not out of wooden branches, but out of palm leaves or palm branches, afal pisha lekaras hahutzin mibifnim, even if you didn't cut down the inner protrusions, mekablin tuma, it's already susceptible to impurity, shekain mekayim inaisan, because that's how it was kept. The palm baskets, people cared more that on the outside it should be smooth. That has to be cut down. But the inner protrusions, you can still use the basket even with the inner protrusions. So even if you didn't cut them out, it's still mekabel tuma. Hakalkala. This is, as the commentaries say, a smaller basket. Same idea, but smaller than a sal. So same thing. Mishayachsoim piha. Once you secure the rim, again with the same procedure of this securing thing, v'yichreis hayotzin, and you cut down, like the palm leaves one, only the protrusions that are sticking out on the outside of the basket. And here the Rambam adds a detail, v'yigmar es hatluyos, and you finish the hanging loop. This we'll see more about in a couple of halachas, but many of these small baskets had loops, like we have today on a regular basket, right? There's kind of like a handle. The kalkala was hung on a wall, had a loop. You'd hang it onto a wall, and it was used even as it was hanging on a wall. And therefore, you have to finish the loop, the hanging loop, and only then is it susceptible to impurity. Beis hakoisesu, beis haliginin, storage spaces for flasks and cups. These flasks and cups, as most commentaries understand them, were glass, so they were very fragile. So they were kept in these wooden or wicker wraps to keep them shielded and protected. So these protective cases, afal pisha lekaras mibifnim, same idea. As long as you cut the protrusions on the outside, even if you didn't cut the ones on the inside, mekablim tuma, they're already susceptible to impurity. Because that's how people used to keep them. They only cared again to have a space inside. Even if you slide the bottle in or slide the cup out, as long as the pokey parts on the outside were cut off, it's fine. Haknoinim haktanim. Knoinim haktanim, there's a little bit of a debate how to explain it, but according to the Rambam, it's some kind of a plate, like a storage plate. The haklasos, and these are women's baskets. They were small baskets. They were used for storing their sewing materials in these baskets. It says the Rambam mishayachsoim sifsei seyen v'yichreis hahutzin hayotzin, same classification. Once you secure their rims and you cut off the protruding outer pokey branches, then it's already fit to become tameh. Haknoinim hagdoilim, large baskets, v'hasugim hagdoilim, and large bins. So these, as they point out in the Art Scroll Mishnayos, a little bit of a different picture. They were formed by a process that's not called weaving, rather it's called coiling. Coiling basically means you take material and you form it into a very long cord. The Rambam writes in his commentary to the Mishnah, these cords could be 100 amas long, 150 feet long. That's how big these baskets and bins were. So you made these massive cords, and then, roped. Like roped, yeah, exactly, roped style. And then you would coil them like this, one around the other. As you went around each wrap, you would stitch them. That's how they held together. Then once you reached the circumference of how big you wanted the bottom to be, then instead of rolling them around each other, you began going upwards, on top, like this. The coils began to go upwards.
You see these today?
Yeah, sure do. So these were what's called Keilim Hagdelim is big baskets, Sugim Hagdelim is big bins. Same idea. So the Rambam says, at what point do they become fit for impurity? Mishayase Shnei Durim L'Reichav Shalahen. Once you make 2 rows on their width, it actually means on their height. In other words, once you finish the entire circumference of the bottom and you go 2 rows upwards, 1 wrap, a second wrap. Now, even if you're planning to make it higher, but at the point that you get 2 rows, it's already has a form of a utensil, could be used, and so it's Mekabel Tuma. Yam Nafa Ukvara, the screen of a sieve and a sifter. Yeah, classic sifter. How's sifter made? You have this meshwork. That's the screen of the actual sifter, and then it's surrounded by. Today's day, it's mostly metal, but they used to have wood around it. Now, the Rambam says, at what point does this screen of a sifter become tameh, and also the kaf shel meznayim, a balance of a scale? Let me just bring this up here so you can see. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but where's my scale? Oh, this, yeah? What was the scale? Scale is a classic, it was a balanced pole, and then the pole going the other way. Then you have the pans where they used to put the stuff inside. So this is a metal one, but they used to make them out of also wood or wicker. So the Rambam says, at what point do these things become tameh? Mishayase dur echad l'reichav shalahen. They only require 1 row. They were also coiled in the same way as the coiling baskets. The bottom was made like this, and then it would go up a little bit to become a little pan. Once you make 1 row, that's already enough to be used as part of a balance scale. Hakupa is also a basket, but it was made in a little bit of a different way, in which I believe it's what's called rings. Basically, in this picture, it's 1 long cord. Mm-hmm. The kupa was made out of just, you take a ring of wicker, then you wrap it around with another ring. So it wasn't 1 long cord, it was multiple circles. Circle around the circle around the circle. And again, they were also stitched together. So, similar concept, says the Rambam, Mishayase shtei tzfiresh l'reichav shela. Once you make 2 rings going upwards, so you finish the circumference, then you begin to go upwards, building the height. Once you do 2 layers of the height, it's already Mekabel Tuma. The arak is they call it a strap basket. It was a very long, narrow basket used by different artisans to store their tools in it. Mishayase by tzfira achas, once you make 1 ring. Same idea, it was a ring basket, 1 ring going up, it's already Mekabel Tuma. Afal pisha like gamar gavhan, even though in all these scenarios you didn't finish your intended height. You want to make the basket very tall. But once you made 2 rows, Mekabel Tuma, they're already Mekabel Tuma, Share Nidu L'Mashanasu, because they're now fit to be used for the purpose for which they were made. Baharei Tzuras Akli Aleyan, and they already have a form of a utensil on them. Lamaza Daimel, what can this be compared to? Lebeget Shanarag Miktsasai, piece of clothing that you partially wove. You didn't finish the whole shirt, but it could already be used as somewhat of a piece of clothing. So it's already Mekabel Tuma, it's already fit to become impure. Hamachzeles, a mat, classic mat. Misha Yichres Hahutzin, once you cut off the protruding pieces of material, and here the commentators explain it means the surface ones, not the edges. Mats were woven, right? You always had protrusions at the edges. But here there's also things sticking out into the surface, which made it uncomfortable to lie on. So once those are cut off, that's already Mekabel Tuma, V'zehu Gemar Malachta. This classifies as the conclusion of its work, even as the commentators explain, even if you have in mind to add more parts to the process, this, according to halacha, is the final step of forming this mat. The chol kle hanesarim, or some texts have hanetzarim, all wicker utensils in the Mekabel Tuma ad sheyischas musif seisein, are never susceptible to impurity till you seal their rims, as in this for the basket, but it's true of any wicker utensil. You got to seal down its rim so it doesn't have any protrusions. Golme kleyates, unfinished wooden utensils. Now, when we say unfinished, we mean unfinished design-wise. It's already been fashioned, but you're planning to maybe draw on it or paint it or color it, this kind of a thing. Mekabel Tuma mishanasa hakli b'tzurasya. The Rambam says the moment the utensil achieves its basic form, it can already become tamei. Afal pishu asid l'tarei bisrat. Even if later on you want to design it with different markings, or to exactly make it symmetrical using a compass, or to refine it with a plane. You want to flatten it and make it nice. And anything similar to these actions. And therefore it's still considered to be somewhat of an unfinished product. Nevertheless, since it's not lacking carving, you've already carved out its shape. And you finished the digging meaning, let's say it's a bowl. So you finished already making the whole harezem mekabel tuma. At this point, it's already fitting to become tamei. V'chol goyim leklei eitz mekabel tuma. All unfinished wooden utensils are susceptible to impurity. Chutz mishal eshkeroya, except for what's called boxwood. Boxwood apparently she'ein hakli mimenu chashuv kli ad sheyisyape. I don't know why, but utensils weren't considered even basic utensils until they were finished and really fully refined. The karev be'enai, it seems to me, it's close in my eyes, shekli etzem ki kli shel eshkeroya, that bone utensils are like boxwood utensils, ve'ein gil mehen mekablin tuma, and their unfinished state is not fitting to become impure. They have to be fully polished down and refined, ready to go. Another basic rule, kol eitz, or kli eitz, she'ein alav tzuras kli, any piece of wood that doesn't have a form of a utensil, afal pisha mishtamshin boy, ein mekabel tuma, even though you use it in the state of not having a form of a utensil, it is not able to become tamei because it doesn't have a form of a utensil. And here the Rambam goes into a whole bunch of things that halacha defines as having a form or not having a form. Aruchos. You have aruchos or arubais? You have a bet, huh? You have a vet, you have a chaf. There's different versions in the Mishnah. They both mean the same thing. Aruchos are basically a large board. The Rambam says, Arucha shel nachtoimin sheseder nalei nachales keshehin batzik. It's baker's boards that you set up the loaves while they're still dough. So we'll soon see there was a board on which you braided challahs or loaves, and then you would transfer them to this other board from which they were transferred into the oven. So this second board where you put the ready-made loaves is called the aruchos or the aruvais. Says the Rambam mistamos. These baker's boards could become tamei shaharei tzuras hakli alein because they have what's called the form of a utensil, whereas v'shel ba'alei batim einan mekabel tuma. Regular homeowners' boards are not mekabel tuma because they don't have a form of a utensil. And the commentaries debate why that is. What's the difference between a regular baker's one and a homeowner's one? And they basically say that a baker, because they used it so often, they would finish it down and sand it down very nicely. So it had a form of a utensil. Homeowners were fine with having more rough boards, so it wasn't called a halachic tzuras kli. However, if a homeowner goes and paints his boards with red paint or with saffron dye, so then, or anything like it, mistamais, they could become tamei, shaharei nases lahen tzuras kli. The painting gives it a form of a utensil. Okay, sroid shel nachtoimen. What is a sroid of bakers? Shenoisten by hamayim shemekatfin by. It's the utensil which you put water in, the water which you use for spraying. Apparently, while bakers were working with dough, they had a side little utensil with water in it, on which they would rub their hands, either to just get their hands moist, or they would take from the water and then sprinkle onto the loaves to keep them wet. So the Rambam says the baker's ones are tamei. They're impure, or they could become impure. V'shel ba'alei batim tahar. Homeowners' ones stay pure. And again, the reason is probably, the Rambam doesn't say clearly, but probably because of this finished and unfinished. Bakers were always making sure to refine their utensils, make them more finished, not so homeowners. If you built a rim to this utensil from all four sides, then even a homeowner's one will become tamei, biblically as the commentaries say, because it's a full kli. Nifratz meruach achas tahar. Once one of the sides of the rims comes down, even one side, it's fully pure. And we don't say, oh, once you built a rim, at least keep it rabbinically impure. No, it's fully pure. By the way, if the Rambam's talking about building a rim, that means that by default it didn't have a rim. So the commentators wonder, how do you store water in a flat utensil that has no rim? So there's different explanations for that. They talk about how they would design it. Maybe it was a flat, like a little bit warped maybe. But interesting point. The haluach she'erchen alav mistame. The board upon which bread was braided, that's different than the aruchos or the aruvais. This is an earlier stage. This is a board which you braided the loaves on. Mistame, that could become tamei, because it had the form of a utensil. So it's potentially able to become tamei. Kli shel eitz, the wooden utensil shehasalosim mirakdin alav es haseles, that professional flour sifters would sift their flour over. This was like a catcher of sorts. A wooden utensil on the bottom, and it would catch all the flour. Mistame, it could become tamei because the flour merchants who did it professionally would again refine their utensils in very professional ways. Whereas v'shel ba'alei batim tar, if it's a homeowner's one, it was more primitive, so it's pure. It doesn't have a form of a utensil. Rachas hagaroisos. Rachas hagaroisos is a shovel used by, literally it means for beans, but it was basically used for winnowing. The next couple of cases we're going to see, there were different shovel-like implements. Some were used to hold grain or beans. Some were just used to sweep them.
You winnow beans?
Yeah, from the chaff apparently. The bean meats would fall and then the shell would go away. So the guiding rule over here is anything that was used for holding, that's a kli kibul, is tameh, or could become tameh. Anything just used for sweeping, even if it has a shape of a utensil, does not become tameh. Therefore, rachas hagaloisa is mistama. The shovel used for winnowing beans could become tameh because they would scoop up a bunch of beans or a bunch of wheat kernels, hold it in that shovel, and then, throw it away to the air for the winnowing to take place. Whereas v'shaloitzra is tahira. If it was in the storage houses, then it's pure, because the shovels in storage houses were just used to sweep around loose pieces of bean and wheat. Similarly, shalgitais, the shovels used in a wine press, mistama, could become tameh because they were used to hoist or to carry out the waste that would accumulate from the grapes to the outside. So they were used to actually carry. V'shal granes tahira, but the ones in granaries were pure because they were not used to hold, they were just used to sweep. As the Rambam says now, Zahakal, this is the rule, ha'asil lekabala mekabel tuma, things made to hold could become tameh. The ha'asil lechanes by tar, things used just to sweep or just to gather, is pure. It's not made for holding. Halacha beis kol hatloyin or tluyin tahirin. All hanging loops, we mentioned before, are pure. Hanging loops were these types of things like this. They were attached to utensils, and typically they were just there to make it easy to move the utensil from place to place. They didn't assist in the functionality of the utensil, and therefore they're always pure. They never become impure. Even if the utensil that they're attached to becomes impure, they don't. Except for the following things, 4 loops that do help the functionality of utensils. Chutz, except for, number 1, mitloye nafa shel salasin, the loops of sifters used by flour merchants, utloy kvara shel granos, and the hanging loops of sieves that were used in granaries. And these, basically, as the commentaries explain, these were actually massive sifters. They weren't like what today we have a little sifter. They were these big sifters, and the way they were actually used, it was filled with wheat and all this stuff. And once they were filled to their full capacity, they were too heavy to be lifted and sifted. They were placed between 2 stones, 2 big stones. You put a sifter on top of it, and a person would stand on the side and shake the sifter, like agitate it. And then the stuff would go through. And in order to position it, sometimes he would actually use the loop to help him position it, to help move the sifter. So the loop becomes actually part of the functionality of the utensil, and therefore it could become tameh. Similarly, utloi magal yad, the loop of a hand sickle. So this was like a classic sickle, and it had a little loop at the edge. You could hold it, and you would use the handle of the loop to keep the grip. So again, it helps with the functionality of the utensil. Similarly, utloi makal habaloshin, the handle or the loop on a tax collector's stick. The tax collectors, if a person came with a full wagon of stuff, they would take their stick and they would punch it into the wagon to make sure there's nothing that they're hiding. So when you stick a stick deep into a pile of grain, it could get stuck. So they would have these loops that would help them to schlep it out, and also for grip. Point is, it helps with the utensil, and therefore, because they help during the actual work time, so they can become tameh. This is the rule. Any hanging loop that's made to also help during work allows it or could become impure. If it's just there to hang the utensil, so it's pure. Halacha gimel nivlei hameshayrim. Classic lyres used by musicians. They were mistamin. They could become tameh. What are these lyres? They're either a classic, like a harp-shaped type of a thing. Some say that Rambam holds that they're more like a bagpipe. And so because they had a little bag area, these musicians would actually store coins that they were used for pay in those bags. So it became somewhat of a storage keli. So it could become tameh. However, v'nivle b'nei Levi, the Levites' lyres, shemezamnin bahen b'mikdash, which were used in the Holy Temple, tahirin, they're pure. Why? Because they weren't paid for their services. So they never had coins in their lyre, so it was never used for storage, so it's not a keli.
But if you store the kli itself, the needle,
doesn't matter. Because if it's not used as a utensil, so it itself can't become tamei. Habitnoin. Bitnoin comes from the word beten, stomach instrument. They say it's this. The sitar, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah? Sitar. So it would go across the stomach. It's called the bitnoin. The haniktamoin. Niktamoin means the amputee instrument. And the commentaries say either it was made to resemble the form of a leg of an amputee, or, the Rambam writes this in his commentary to the Mishnah, it was made by a person who himself was an amputee. So it was called after him. We don't know exactly what this instrument is. The ha'irus is a tambourine. Mistamin, they can all become tamei because they all have an area. Yeah. Kesef Mishnah writes, it says drum over there? No, he writes over here, it says, it's round, it's Kesef Mishnah. It has a piece of leather stretched taut over it. Ushmoi ba'arvi, in Arabic it's called iltar. Ubelaz tanburo. He says tanburo, like tambourine. Tambourine, yeah. Basically, these were all utensils because they used to store things in it. They used to, like, after the tambourine ceremony, they would hand it out to collect payment. Turn it over and they would say, here, put something in it. This is a sitar, yeah. So it also had a little hollow in it where you could put stuff in it. Anyway, the point is that it has the shape of a utensil. It was used to hold things, so it's impure, or it could become impure. Dalid mitsudas hachulda mistama, a weasel trap could become tamei b'shal achbarim tahira, but a mouse trap stays pure. Lefisha ein ba beis kivul ve'ein aleh tzudas kli, because the way these mouse traps were formed, it was a very primitive device. It didn't have a place to hold. It didn't have a form of a utensil, whereas apparently a weasel trap did. Not sure exactly the difference, but therefore, weasel's bigger, needs more space. Could be. Halacha he, hutzin, branches, sha'ergin mehen k'may kfifa, which were used to weave some kind of a basket, shemanichin baha te'enim v'chayetzim, where you put figs in it. This is the common understanding of it. It's from this Mishnayos. It's more of a loose basket. Okay, so it could hold thicker things like figs, not smaller things. It's called a patilia in the Mishnah. Mistama, it can become tamei. It has the status of a tzuras, a form of a utensil. However, v'sha'ergin mehan ketavnis megura gedela, the branches that you use to weave a massive basket of sorts, sha'oitzrin v'hachitim, where you store wheat in it, tohira, it's pure, she'ein teiras kli aleha, it doesn't have a status of a utensil. The Ravad over here gives the reason. He says because these branches were so loose that if you moved it, they would break. They were just made in place to hold wheat, but not meant to be transported. And the common understanding is that the Rambam agrees with this. Others say that Rambam argues and says that it's not a kli for a different reason, but we'll go with the standard. The Ravad is just giving the reason for the Rambam, that since it's very big and very loose, so you don't move it, so it has no status of a utensil. Halacha vav, olin shemisar genaisan kimin siyag saviv laperes, leaves that were woven into a kind of a fence, a protective fence around fruits. There's a name for this, I forget what it's called, but basically when you had moist fruits, so you wanted to protect them. So you take a bunch of leaves and you would cover it, but in this woven form. So it became a kind of a utensil, almost. So the Rambam says tahir, that's pure. It doesn't have a status of utensil halachically. If you made it out of wicker, not out of leaves, now it's more sturdy. Now it does have a status of utensil, and it could become tamei. Halacha zayin chaysel shel hutzin, a bag or a wrap, also made out of interwoven branches, shemanichin by haroitev v'chayetzebe, which you put in. Roitev is moist dates, fresh dates. So you think disposable started only now? It was also back in the day. Many times these wraps were made for one-time use. So the Rambam says, if it's a consistent wrap, it's meant to be reused, you put it inside, you take it out, you reuse it again, then it could become tamei. But if you cannot remove what's in the wrap until you rip it open or untie it, it was just made for one-time storage. Or even if not, but in your mind it's disposable. You thought you want to just eat it, what's in it, and then throw it away. Tahar, then it is pure, because it isn't a lasting utensil. Similarly, a horn-shaped utensil. Like, narrow on the side, wider on the other side. Which you use it only once, and then you throw it away, eina mekabeles tuma, it is not able to become tameh. But if you decide in your mind that you're going to use it for more extensive use, then mekabeles tuma could become tameh. Halacha ches ha-shoifar, eina mekabel tuma. Shofar, yeah, for the mitzvah that you use for the mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah, it's not able to become tameh. If you then, after the holiday, you cut it down and you want to make it into a storage horn just to use, they also used it for drinking sometimes. Put water in it. Then mikabel tuma, then it can become tameh because now you've designated it not for a mitzvah but for a regular utensil. Halacha tes kaira shekva b'shida tevo migdal. You have a plate of sorts, and you attached it to a big chest or a big cabinet. So, I'm not sure why, but you just did that. If you attached it in a way that it could still hold, that's called right side up. But as the Rambam explains elsewhere, it means that you attach it to the floor of the bin or the big chest. You have a big chest, you attach a plate to the bottom of it. So the plate is still standing right side up and it can still hold in that position. It's still, on its own, could become tameh. It's not considered nullified or secondary to the larger chest that it's attached to. However, if you attach it to the wall of the chest, so you put it to the wall, now the plate is sideways. The plate can't hold as is. It cannot hold until you tilt the bin on its side. Now the plate will be again right side up. So then, it's considered part of the bin, and it is now pure. Because it loses its independent status as a utensil. Halacha Yud, ha'akoin. An akoin is a box that's a fish trap. It basically was this box that was formed with metal hooks sticking out of it, open on one side. You put it in the river, fish come through, and they attach to the hooks, they become trapped. V'haretoiv. Haretoiv is a wooden bird trap. Made like a kind of a basket. It would catch these birds in different ways. The hakluv shalates, on a wooden cage for birds. Tohaydin, these are all pure. They're not considered to be utensils for the laws of Tumah. Halacha Yud Aleph, hamadaf, the board trap. What's the board trap? This is one of two things. Either it's like a classic bird snare. You basically have a stick with a board on top, and then you put little seeds or bird food under. The bird comes, hits the stick, wood comes down, traps. Or it's what's called elsewhere in the Mishnah, the shavsheves. It was like a stick with a board on top, but you put glue on the board with bird feet. When the birds come, they get stuck to the board, and that's it. That's the madaf, the board used for the bird trap. The hapaltzur. A paltzur is also some kind of wooden bird trap. It's not clear exactly what the shape is. Umitsudas sakarin. And the dammer's trap. Interesting concept. I think it exists somewhat today. Sakarin is like secher, like a dam. Basically, people that were interested in trapping lots of fish at once, what did they do? They used to divert part of a river into an enclosure. They built an enclosure over here, let's say, and they would divert a bunch of water in, then which presumably had fish. Then they would drain all the water and leave the fish. So that's it. In a half a second, you get yourself tons of fish. That's mitsudas sakarin. Now, according to the Rambam, this enclosure was itself a utensil. It wasn't like dug into the ground. It was like an actual box. They used to put this big box down, divert water into the box, and then out of the box. So that's the mitsudas sakarin. Mistamin, all these things, these traps, can become tameh sharitzuras kliale, and they do have a form of a utensil. Halacha Yud Beis hasafsalin shebapundikiyos, benches in little inns, b'shel melamde tinoikos, and benches of teachers. Today, every kid is by his own desk and his own chair. In those days, you came to class, you had one bench, that's it. So, and the teacher also had a bench. Even though they have holes, rather large holes for the feet of the legs of the bench to go inside, they remain pure. They don't have a tzuras kli. Once you attach the legs by nail, now they're considered to be a full utensil, it's gemar malachton, and they can become tameh. Zahaklal, this is the rule. If a piece or a utensil could be moved, and its legs won't move along with it, even if legs are currently attached, like the bench, it remains pure. But if you move it and the legs go with it because it's nailed in, then If it's fully wood or bone, then it can become tamei, because it's all one type of material. If one of the legs is stone, and stone is not mekabel tuma, then that converts the status of the entire bench. The entire bench, entire utensil, doesn't become tamei at all.